So what I would say before we get started, while people join in, is that there is a large amount of images that are coming in, some from Twitter. Actually, I see Juan Martin online that are so beautiful. I think that probably for our next SEVA VentRounds, we're gonna have to do like again another the best waveforms from Twitter, because there are some that you have been posting, Juan Martin, that are just outstanding. And not only you, there's several on. So I just chose, as usually as we do in VentRounds, several different waveforms that we had on our archives, and we'll go over them. So this is against SEVA VentRounds. Today is August 10th, 2021, and you'll see why it's called 4 different modes dissected. So let's get started. Again, we discussed particulars of ventilator modes. There's no endorsements of any particular mode. Manufacturer or company, if the ventilator has a screen and you can send it, we will publish it here. We don't have any problem with any of them. We love to read waveforms. Whatever we say, it's our opinion, and it does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. Here's my conflicts of interest and Rob's, for all of you to be aware. These are recorded sessions, so keep your microphone muted just for the sake of your peace of mind. And then I may call upon members of the audience to comment. Otherwise, now we can see the chat compared to last week. Just write up what you're thinking. We'll call upon you, and we can discuss this even more. We will put the WebEx poll to elicit audience interaction. Remember, we're trying to get you to go through the flow of this how we read the waveforms, and obviously there's things that come there. This is all anonymous. We don't record anything of those answers, so feel free to enter them as you may. And for the Cleveland Clinic employees, there's going to be CME at the end of this code, and we're working on getting actually RT based CEUs for all of you. Which I think that it's positive. And I see several of our friends and fellows, ex-fellows, and other caregivers around the world. It's wonderful to have you around. Okay, so I'm gonna put, this is the first waveform that we're gonna put on. I'm gonna shoot the poll and see, let you guys answer as it's coming out. If I can find the poll. Where's the poll? Well, I cannot find the poll. I should have a poll. Well, let's let the poll be, just watch it. Anybody wants to read it, or from the fellows here, anybody is up to reading this waveform? Have no fear. And again, I'll say it, we learn every single time. So if you, this is nothing perfect, just get at it and we'll discuss what you see. Anybody wants to go at it?
I can go at it, Dr. Morales.
All right. Who's this?
Udi.
Udi. We start with Udi. Okay, Udi. We're all yours. Go for it.
Okay. So for the tag, I'm going to look at usually first the passive breath and the flow waveform, which I think is pretty machine made. So I'm going to say volume control. I see that it's both machine started and machine cycled. So it's going to be CMV. And the targeting scheme. So looking at the second breath, I see that I think the flow waveform after it goes, I think it goes into a different targeting scheme. So I wonder if this is a dual or yeah, that's my best guess. Okay. In my load, I would say the first breath is, I don't see much patient effort, so I would say this is mostly elastic uh, in the inspiration, and expiration too. In the first breath, it's elastic, but the second breath, I think there's a lot of PMOS. Um, Trigger wise, I think the trigger is normal. I don't see any early trigger. The first one is machine triggered, the second one is patient triggered, as you can see from the color change. Inspiration in so in the first breath, I don't see any work shifting, it's normal. In the second breath, so if I'm seeing it's volume control, so I should see any PMOS in the pressure waveform, and the pressure waveform kind of dips down in the middle of the breath, which means that the patient is trying to take a breath uh, over the machine. So I think there would be work shifting in the second breath. Um, Cycle, I think the first breath is fine. The second breath, as you can see, after the flow gets cut off, the flow wave again goes back to the towards the baseline, and I think that's the patient trying to inhale. So I would say that this is probably early cycle in the second breath. And in expiration, first breath, I don't think it's normal. In the second breath, um, um, could be, I would say it's normal. Yeah, not sure of that. Going back to the tag, just looking back, just if I can revise my tag, is it dual or is it just PMOS on top of the patient breath? So I may actually change it to just CMVS. Give me a second guessing myself.
All right. Thank you, Udi. Very, very nice work as always. Rob, you want to
I would like to push this over to Ariel because he has, I think, the correct tag anyways.
Okay, go ahead.
Ariel, you still awake?
Yeah, I'm here, Rob. I'm glad to this time to participate. On my previous graphics, I didn't, and this mode is, I mean, one of these pictures would make me think about this classification of as the fourth variation of IMB. This is the servo I. It's activating the extra flow option is activated. The first breath is a regular volume control breath. The conditional variable that triggers the change in control variable is not activated, and we can see that on the second one. The second breath is flow triggered. We can see how the flow is the values of the inspiratory flow are predefined by the tidal volume, peak flow, and flow shape, but the conditional variable is activating, so the flow is liberated by passing to pressure control. I would say pressure control generically, but it seems to be cycling by flow by switching to pressure support. So this kind of breath changes from being a mandatory into an spontaneous one. And I agree that there seems to be what caught my attention is that the inspiratory effort goes beyond what the machine can give this patient, and usually the eye time could be extended. We can see how high is the second tidal volume because we are liberating the inspiratory flow. So it's a volume control, intermittent mandatory ventilation because we have the presence of mandatory and spontaneous in this mode, which happen in a breath-to-breath basis, and it's a dual mode because inside a breath, the mode has the capacity to change the control variable from volume to pressure. Yeah, that's all I can say about that mode. That's the fourth variation of IMB.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ariel. And for those of you that don't know, Ariel Garnero is a respiratory therapy Right now you're in Mississippi, correct, Ariel?
University of Missouri.
Missouri, sorry, Mississippi, Missouri. And he has written also and educated a lot around the world on this nomenclature. So welcome, Ariel. Thank you. So
Thank you.
absolutely, the key here is that this is IMB, Udi, and in this breath, it seems that it was time cycle because of the way that you still have evidence of inspiratory flow. You caught that one very nicely, I think. So I applaud that. Well, if the patient had done even more effort, then it cycles by flow, and then because it was patient triggered and it's patient cycled, it becomes a spontaneous breath and it goes into this IMB circumstance, and that's only present in that type of dual targeting. Roberto?
Yeah, that's a very subtle point. It's probably what happened on that particular breath, but in general, I agree with what Ariel said. This is IMV. And then that brings us to the point of triggering and cycling. Trigger is normal in the sense that there was no delay, but you will see that on that second breath, the patient initiated a spontaneous breath after the ventilator initiated a machine triggered breath. And we would call that early triggering on the part of the ventilator, also known as reverse triggering, right?
No, but there is activity of the patient. It triggered in the second breath, Rob. So the patient.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So that's like a double trigger then, isn't it?
No, just I think that he started here and he had enough effort, and he met the threshold around here. So he met the 3 cc's.
Yeah. That's what that is.
And then it activated it, and then he finished around here.
Yeah, that's right. That small period of constant flow was the ventilator was just waiting for the pressure to drop to the threshold.
Right.
Yeah, that's what happens. That's good. Good correction.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So if this is a dual targeting mode, so the first one's volume control, the second one is triggered by the patient, and then it's initially volume control, then it changes to pressure control, and then it's cycled by time as opposed to flow. Would that then make this actually a mandatory breath as opposed to spontaneous? Because wouldn't spontaneous be cycled via flow?
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah,
So,
strictly speaking, that's correct. Yep.
So ultimately, wouldn't it still be volume control CMVD because we have no spontaneous breaths? They're all mandatory breaths.
Yes, but so is this Patrick? Well, so who was this speaking? So I can.
It's Patrick speaking.
Yeah, Patrick. So yes, absolutely. So one thing to know is that whenever you have the flow adaptation on, there's going to be breaths that, for example, if you would see the screen, every single one of them would look like CMB because there's no patient activity. If the patient does a little bit of activity, you will see this one. But if the patient does a lot of activity and he goes for a longer period of time, then it's going to be flow cycled. And we know that from doing it on the lab. And so that's how we know that that's the targeting scheme for this mode. But just by looking at this, you're correct. You would call this one CMB, BC, CMB, D, just by that screen that you have in front of you. So that's a good catch.
That's a good catch, and it's important to make that distinction because the GE ventilators have dual targeting as well, but they always time cycle. They don't ever let you flow cycle. So you can't get a spontaneous breath in between two mandatory breaths.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. All righty. So the next part, so this is a beautiful analysis of a mode in itself. This is again dual. We call it the clandestine because you never know when it's active unless you go and look for it in reality. So what's the load? And I thought that this would be a good discussion here of trying to figure out what's the load for this patient. You thought this was elastic load, and so the flow is constant. Somebody set up the rise time a little bit delayed, so it's not a perfect square. So that's why you don't get a very nice step up here to see how much of that was the resistive load. And then you have throughout the flow, the pressure keeps curving. I don't know if you see that. It's not a straight, beautiful curve. What do you think about that? Or any comments from the audience? So instead of being, this should be in reality, if all things were perfect, this should be a straight line, and then it should look something like that. Something like that. Well, maybe the second one. What? Any thoughts from the group or Uri or anybody?
So yeah, I see that the curve is there. Um, the curve is more positive, which is, I feel that if there was resistive load, uh, yeah, I think probably sign of some PMOS in there.
Well, that one could be PMOS actually. So the patient is trying to bear down and it increases the pressure. Any other causes for this?
Must be a little bit of hysteresis,
Yeah. So what causes that?
just like the opening of the alveoli.
Yeah. So that you can see that under situations in which you are recruiting, right? So that's what we call this the stress index. So the stress, it would say that instead of being straight a constant, the compliance is changing. Actually, at the end of the breath, the pressure required to deliver that amount of packets of volume has gone down.
Yeah, the key there is that a straight line represents a constant elastance, right? So that's a change in pressure for a change in volume, which is, since it's a constant flow, the horizontal axis could be just changed to volume. So that's the slope of that line is elastance. And a straight line means that the elastance is linear, meaning meaning constant. If it's non-linear, like it is here, concave downward, then that means the elastance starts out high and ends low. Or you could say compliance starts out low and ends high. So it's changing. So the compliance is getting better, or the elastance is getting better, which means something is happening in the lungs to explain that. And recruitment is a good way to explain that.
So, so that's one of the observations. One of the tricks here, I think that the other one is the fact that because they didn't set up the rise time immediate to be immediate on this flow. Don't ask me why they decided to put a variable here that we could change on the ventilator, but it should be a square. Then then this you would expect to see here the rapid rise that you would see on if the resistance is high. So I really cannot read the inspiratory waveform very well because of this to see if there is a resistive component. And then there's what it seems like evidence of recruitment or changing inspiratory or changing compliance. So I like them to go down and see the. Somebody needs to mute. I think it's Ariel. I'm going to mute you, Ariel, because there's reverberation. There is the flow waveform is passive. So when you see the flow waveform being passive, those how much time is it getting you to get to zero flow?
Almost 3 seconds.
Yeah, so it's a fair amount of time, right? Which makes you now suspicious if this patient has a resistive load, a higher resistive load. And I cannot read this completely, but this makes me suspicious for it. And I would like to do an inspiratory pause on this patient just to see if there's a big step down there. But that raises my concern, Udi. I do agree with you that there is evidence of PMOS here. Absolutely. So I would probably say that there is the inspiratory phase. I cannot read it completely. I suspect that there is recruitment or changing compliance as the breath is delivered, and that on the expiration is probably resistive or normal. Any other comments? There is a comment from Dilip that says, how does the machine decide the TI? Oh, that's a good one. The TI here is longer than the previous. That's correct. There is the way that they do it, and Rob, there's a very nice graph on the manual of the Servo Eye that if the effort is ending and goes below 3 centimeters, it will shut off the breath. But if the patient is continuous and the tidal, and it has to do with the amount of tidal volume that has been delivered. So it will either transition to a spontaneous breath or it will shut it off earlier than that, Dilip. I don't have it right now with me, but there's an algorithm for that. All righty. Ariel, you want to say something?
Yes, I'm a servo user, and many people in my department they use this kind of delay on reaching the peak flow because they think that they're gonna reach a lower PAP, and it's the opposite. Because since we have the event set on a fixed side time, the surface of that waveform is gonna be the same. So whenever we put a delay, the peak inspiratory flow increases, so the PAP is gonna be slightly higher. And the second thing, we also use NAVA, and sometimes something I learned is not because a breath is initiated by the machine is not a reverse triggering, because we have observed sometimes auto-triggering inducing reverse triggering on patients that are I was incapable of triggering the vent.
Yeah, so we'll get into, so let me answer the first one. So what do you mean by PAP? We are not familiar with that statement.
Oh, sorry, the peak pressure, PIP.
Okay, yeah, so the peak airway pressure will definitely be affected by the rise time, which it's inconsequential in our eyes because this is just resistive. So we agree with you, Ariel, absolutely. Rob, any comment on that?
No, that's good.
Yeah. And then the second part about reverse triggering, we abandoned that term reverse trigger because it talks about the mechanism. So I think that entrainment of the respiratory rate can cause different patient ventilator discordances, and we can talk further about that. There were some very nice cases. One of them that came yesterday in Twitter demonstrating that particular statement. So let's move on, and we'll come back to that. Thank you, Ariel. In terms of trigger, we don't see reverse trigger here. I think that we all agree with that now. There is no evidence of other PMOs. This seems to be a patient that started an effort and finished over here. There's work shifting without a doubt. The pressure drops below what it was, and it's now below the baseline, so it's just work shifting. And then in terms of cycle, it's early on this breath, as you appropriately indicated, Uri. Very well. You saw that rise on the flow trying to reach baseline, and it didn't. And then expiration is essentially normal, although this one does have any effort. So I would want to ask, Uri, would you change anything on this ventilator or not?
Um,
And that's okay if you say no. It's this is free country.
um, Yes, first I'd like to figure out sort of my target, like safety, comfort, or liberation. And in this situation, I feel that the patient is taking a breath probably a lot slower. I mean, respiratory is 14. Um, I mean, I don't know, first thing comes to mind, maybe try to reduce sedation, trying to see if the patient can trigger more breaths. Um, Yeah, I guess my first question is this: is this a situation looking at the patient vent interaction? Is this of over assistance or under assistance? And I believe that this will be, I guess, over assistance. And those are just the thoughts I'm thinking.
Well, thank you, Lee. I think that, and that's why I think that the next step after you read one of these is saying, well, what am I trying to do? And just by looking at this human being, I mean, he's on 380 of tidal volume, respiratory rate of 14, and a PEEP of 16. And I would wonder, I mean, what's the goal? Probably he's still on the either the safety or transitioning towards comfort because they still trying to control the tidal volume. But if you were on safety and you were seeing these type of recruitment through the breath, would that trigger you guys change in PEEP, or would you leave it right there?
I think if there is recruitable lung, I think we would try to recruit for sure.
Anybody, any other opinion on that? Would you leave it there? The PEEP go up, down?
Well, if you're going to interpret that as a stress index, that would indicate that there's a possibility of recruitment, and stress index was originally described for doing optimum PEEP maneuvers. So you could put a plateau in there and increase the PEEP and see if the plateau changes, or you could just actually calculate the compliance on 2 different PEEPs, or any of the other 20 different ways to do optimum PEEP, right?
Yeah.
But wouldn't you first make the graph perfectly as it was described? So I would change the rise time. I would make sure that there's no patient effort, because if there's some patient effort in between the first breath, it might be affecting the change in compliance. So I'm not sure if these settings are perfect for interpretation of the stress index.
Yeah, thank you, Dalip. That's absolutely on point. I think that's a common issue that we see is that either the patient is doing effort and you already mentioned, well, maybe he's doing some activity exhaling, or there is the waveform is not appropriately set, or the flow is too fast and you're getting other components. So I do think that you need to optimize your waveform to be able to do that. And some of our ventilators actually calculate the stress index. And recently we had a case in which we just simply changed the flow. And the stress index was changing flow by, I mean, as you would, same tidal volume, same PEEP, different flow, different stress index. Which starts telling you the statement of we need to do this in a standardized way of sorts.
I think the original paper said that you have to keep the same flow when you're calculating the stress index.
Exactly, as you're moving across the different PEEPs and whatnot.
2 other comments. One is that the obvious problem with this that we're looking at is that there's a cycle asynchrony. And one way to get rid of that, all the things being equal, is just put this patient in auto mode, right?
Right. So allowing the patient to breathe. I mean, you can notice that this patient, when he took the breath on his own, he went far and beyond the tidal volume. I mean, he's probably, I don't know, 600 of tidal volume. He overcame. He went out of the graph and came down, and then he was still trying to do much more effort. So I think that the algorithm, for the sake of it, worked. At least he didn't get the double trigger, right? It allowed him to breathe through it. So that's an important thing for what this mode did under these circumstances. All righty.
I found the manual, that page, that illustration in the manual, if you want me to show it, if we have time.
Sure. There is no BC to, there is BC to volume support. You're right. All right. So go ahead, Rob, show us the graph.
You see it?
Yeah, I'm seeing actually your manual folder.
Okay, so I shared the wrong thing.
Yep.
How about that?
There you go.
So what that shows is that normally you set a tidal volume, and no, you set a tidal volume and an inspiratory time, and then the flow is dependent on that. And here, the patient makes a small effort, and because the volume is proportional to the area under the flow time curve. You got a little bit more volume in this hump, and therefore you have to shave off a little bit of inspiratory flow time. And this graph makes it important to distinguish between the inspiratory time and the inspiratory flow time, right? So the inspiratory flow time is only the time that flow is positive. The inspiratory time is the whole time that it's between positive and negative. Here, again, you have a slightly larger inspiratory effort. The patient did get a slightly larger tidal volume, even though they decreased the inspiratory flow time. And here, the patient makes a huge effort and has gone beyond the set inspiratory time, so the ventilator can't do anything. It just has to let the patient get whatever tidal volume that they get, and which is what happened in this case, because the patient got a bigger than set tidal volume. So I guess looking at that, that would argue that that breath was not time cycled. It was
Yeah, I think so too.
flow cycled, right?
As I'm looking at this, it looks more
that's
spontaneous one. All right.
yeah. That's why I was curious. How would that explain the cycle asynchrony if it was a spontaneous breath? It's a little confusing.
Well, I think what it seems to by the graph is that it shuts down flow. It's a flow cycle, and it seems that it cycles it off at the same flow that you set the peak flow. You see?
Yeah.
Yeah. That could be true. I don't remember what the algorithm says.
Yeah, and then
Have to
under
look
those
at it.
circumstances, it would be, I mean, it would be flow cycle, but it's by the patient, but it chooses the flow that you have set, and this is something that if we don't know, we can test on the lab easily.
Yeah.
All right, very good. Well, we have dissected this one to death, I would say. Really good. Okay. Let me choose this one since somebody brought it up. I thought it would be cool to sabotage a little bit the environment. Alrighty. Anybody wants to go at this one? Have no fear. As you can see, there's a lot of discussion going on over each one of these. Excellent. Thank you, Ariel. So Ariel says that it cycles at the same peak expiratory flow than the machine calculated peak expiratory flow. Okay. Alrighty. Anybody wants to read this waveform? I intentionally hid the mode. Any of our fellows? This is the uncomfortable waiting period. All right. Anybody else wants to try to read it?
I'll have a go at it.
All right, go for it, Patrick.
So looking at the control variable, it looks like it's going to be a pressure control given there's no sort of consistent volume and flow. So I think it's going to be pressure control. In regards to the breath sequence, so it looks like there may be some, it's hard to tell if there's actually pressure triggering with each of these waveforms. I see a small dip before each flow. So whether that's me, my eyes playing tricks at me, I'm not sure, but it looks
It does change color. I'll make it simple. This is changing to white. So you're right on that.
Okay, so I think each of these waveforms are triggered by the patient, and whether they're cycled by the patient, it looks like it's time cycled though. So I think it's going to be machine cycled as opposed to patient cycled. So I think this is going to be CMV. It looks like I know it looks like the smaller breaths have all got smaller times than the larger breaths. So maybe this, it looks like they're all being cycled at the same flow. So I'm actually going to call this IMV actually. In regards to the load, so evaluating the waveform, so it looks like there's PMUS throughout the inspiratory phase and also some PMUS throughout the expiratory phase. It's hard to truly appreciate whether there's any sort of resistive or elastic sort of load there. In regards to targeting schemes, I feel like it's going to be a set point for both the mandatory and spontaneous breaths. So I'd probably call this PC IMV SS, I think. Now, looking at the triggering, so it looks like there's normal triggering. It looks like the cycling is reasonable. Sorry, when it comes to our work shifting, I think there's a little bit of work shifting on inspiration, and there's expiratory work on expiration as well. So overall, I think it's like a PC, IMB, SS. There's PMUS on inspiration and expiration, normal trigger, normal cycle, work shifting on inspiration and expiration, I think.
Thank you, Patrick. Great trial to start. I have also some input from Ariel. Ariel says PCIMB2 SS cannot rule out a possible auto mode PC pressure support. So let's dissect this one a little bit. And obviously, I know what type of mode is, and so that's a little bit of cheating. But I will not ask for forgiveness because that's okay. So you have two types of breaths. You isolated very well, Patrick, that these are patient trigger, right? So there's patient trigger breaths throughout, and you recognize that there's two types of breaths. There's these ones that are taller and bigger, and there's these ones that are tiny or smaller in pressure, and actually the eye time is different for these two group of patients. And so the longer ones, the larger and longer ones are distinct from the smaller ones. And so the longer ones in this case, and they are regular, so you actually can see that they are all about the same size, and the little ones are probably a little bit different. We can go over them. So these are actually time cycled, so machine cycle, and which are mandatory breaths, those three. So this is a mandatory breath, a mandatory breath, and a mandatory breath. It's hard for me to say just from the waveforms as I look at them to make a determination of what is cycling the breath. This is just on the fact that I know what type of mode it is. But unless you can see something else, Rob, I can't. But I do see two different type of breaths, which means that there has to be, at least on this algorithm, a mandatory and a spontaneous. And then you have that whenever there's spontaneous breaths, there still are the mandatory. And so there's only a couple of modes so when we try to classify IMB, there's modes in which the type 1 IMB is the one in which you have mandatory breath regardless of the presence of spontaneous breath. So this could potentially fit a type 1. Type 2 is when you have spontaneous breaths execute the presence of the mandatory breaths. And so in this case, you can see that the patient is breathing spontaneously, so there's not eliminating. So type 2 is gone. And type 3 would be in which mandatory breaths only appear when you have not met the target minute ventilation, for example, or if there's another mode that has that parameter. So under those circumstances, this ventilator in particular, this is a servo U, does not have that algorithm, so that would not fit there. So this is a type 1 IMB, and these are set point. The smaller ones is pressure support, and the top ones are pressure control breath. So it's an SS. So you were right, Patrick. It's just the type of synchrony. So this is a standard SIMB PC pressure support. All right. Questions, issues, disagreements from the team? Right. Very good. So then the load, I do agree with you. This is PMOS. I mean, this is not decaying as it should. And you see that evidence of effort with different tidal volumes for the smaller ones. And this one is definitely with the effort. Whenever I see this one, and I want to hear the input from the rest of the team, and I see this bimodal, very high peak, and then descending, it makes me think sometimes about increased resistance or two compartments. Any thoughts about that from the team?
Yeah, I've seen that too,
Yeah.
especially when it's consistent like that.
Right. So that there is a fast component and a slow component at the same time on those patients. But I do think that there is evidence of PMOS on this patient. This is not decaying appropriately as it should. So all of these areas PMOS, and I would say that it's the same situation here.
I think that fast component is just the circuit decompressing.
It could be, yes. So it decompresses because there's high resistance or high compliance, high impedance there.
High pressure, yeah.
Yeah. Then the trigger, I think we all agree that it's normal. There's essentially the patient is triggering and pressurizing immediately after it crosses the baseline. There is no major dip on the pressure. There's some work shifting occurring because there's more volume. I mean, there's some work being done by the patient, but some not major, and the cycle seems to be appropriate. This is an artifact over here, similar to this little thing here, this little crevice. It's a little artifact that occurs from the compressing the circuit, perhaps, and then expiratory work there. We talked about that. So that's what I'm seeing here. Any comments, disagreements? Okay. So Patrick, let me ask you now. This is your patient. What? Not that you put him on the mode, but why would you use SIMB on a patient like this? So type 1 PCIMB SS. What would we? Any rationale for it? Any thoughts?
I mean, we could be sort of transitioning from sort of safety to comfort or comfort to liberation in regards to seeing what work they can do on their own with the intermittent mandatory ventilation. So to see whether they pull volumes and ventilate appropriately. So I suspect you'd be transitioning from, or maybe comfort to liberation, see whether they're able to move towards a pressure support like setting. That's what my interpretation would be. Yeah, that's my best guess.
Yeah, it's a.
But here's a question I have for the group. Clinically, why would you want a mode where you get two different tidal volumes? Look at the volume waveform at the bottom. Now, you could maybe argue that that's biological variable ventilation, maybe.
Yeah.
But just conceptually, you have two different kinds of breaths, mandatory and spontaneous breaths. What's the advantage of having two different kinds of breaths for this patient at this point in time? Why not just, for example, go to auto mode?
Yeah, in which he just has spontaneous throughout the breath.
Yeah.
That's I mean, in somebody with this amount of respiratory rate and speed and frequency, IMB per se doesn't make much sense. I mean, type 1, just to maintain the pressure on the airway, or to maintain the recruitment on the airway. That's something I could think, or maintain the gas exchange. But in a patient like this, it seems probably too much. I don't know. There is a message here from Dilipus. Why set P high larger in the mandatory time, larger in the mandatory mode? Was it a confusion between PS and P high? Perhaps the user did not account for PEEP. Oh, so why does so you mean why is it this pressure higher than the one for the pressure support? Dilip, this one?
Yeah, it seems like a intentional effort to set the inspiratory pressure for the mandatory breath higher. Is that differential the PEEP? And could this be like a user interface problem where the user is just confused that PEEP needs to be added, in the second instance? I just wonder why it almost looks like the difference is PEEP.
Yeah, so whoever set this up set an amount of pressure here, right, for the pressure control breath, and an amount of pressure for the pressure support breaths that was lower, probably with the intention of that patient breathing on its own with less pressure for the spontaneous breaths and more for the mandatory breaths to achieve a larger tidal volume. That's what I can think of. Or as you said, user error, but it's the same scale for both in the settings.
Yeah, in this setting, the inspiratory pressure is always above PEEP for both mandatory and spontaneous breaths. It's not for other modes, but I think in this particular one it is.
All right. So we have 13 minutes left. I thought that we should do a fast one. Let's do this one. This one I kind of enjoyed. Anybody wants to read this one?
I can try.
All right, go for it.
So I'd say this is PC CMVS. And then in terms of the load, let's see. So there's some PMIS in expiration. I don't see significant PMIS in inspiration. The time constant seems reasonably normal/slow. So I'm gonna go with elastic maybe and inspiration. And then in terms of the synchrony, trigger seems to be okay, although there is a decent depth there. Makes me wonder if we can make it more sensitive. But then in inspiration, I would say normal, and then cycling wise, I would say there is some early cycling.
Yeah. Really fast. Good job, Ahmed. You read it really. So definitely, I think. Any comments, Rob, about the read from by Ahmed?
No, that's pretty good. There's an offset on the volume scale. I don't know if that's a calibration error, if there's actually a little bit of a leak, or it's an odd looking thing. You see it once in a while.
Yeah. So this one, as I was walking by, caught my attention. So you're absolutely right with the PCCMB. When I saw it for the first time, I said this is an elastic load, right? So it decays relatively fast. It looks certainly exponential to a big extent, right? And so I said, oh, it's passive. And then as I was going through it, I said, well, definitely this is normal. It looks to pressurize relatively fast, but it's a pressure trigger, as you can see here, the change in color. So it's a pressure trigger, another one of those cases in which the pressure is triggering now, and you see the dip that the patient has to get to generate that, and actually the change in flow the patient had to cross, and then eventually gets the breath trigger for that. And so then I read this and I said, I saw this thing here, and immediately my thought was, this is early cycle, right? And more, but shouldn't we then, if there's this amount of effort to trigger, see evidence of PMOS during inspiration?
Yeah, I was actually, I'm sorry, I was actually looking at the start of the waveform to see if there's evidence. In that case, I might have called it like a late trigger or something, but yeah, but there isn't any. And it makes me wonder if why they set the trigger to be pressure and maybe less sensitive is trying to palliate what's happening here with the actual problem, which is the early cycling, but that's just probably making the patient work harder without fixing the problem. But yeah, I have no explanation why I can see PMIS and inspiration. It's interesting.
So the question for me is, are we seeing, is this, if I drew PMOS on this patient, is the PMOS this big right? And here's where the breath ends and where it starts. Or what we're seeing is one effort and two efforts. And then this patient has a missed trigger here, or a failed trigger, sorry. What is the thought here of the team? You see what I'm showing? It sabotaged me because I would have expected this to look, the flow to look like that, kind of, and then it would shut off, and then it would show that effort there, and I don't see that.
Well, maybe if the patient had really stiff lungs, then the effort that he was making wasn't enough to give you much flow. If you look at the volume waveform, clearly there's an effort because you got sort of like an artificial inspiratory hold.
Well, but that's on the second one, right? On the second effort, actually, there's a decay. The patient exhales a certain amount, and then this thing comes, this belly. So if he can do this deformation over here of the flow, shouldn't he be doing that deformation here?
You would think so.
Yeah.
I think there are two efforts because the pressure waveform is not that deflected either because, like you guys say, the ventilator is not a very good controller of the pressure. So we're not seeing any deflection on the pressure time either, which you would see if there was a persistent effort or a very strong effort mid-cycle.
Nice. So probably one of the ways to detect this better, besides putting the hand on this patient, is to do an end expiratory pause and see what actually the patient is doing, if he's doing one effort or two efforts.
It's kind of odd that it's such a regular thing, though. How could you do two efforts so regularly like that, like clockwork?
Exactly. So I think that this is either a early cycle or a failed or a failed trigger, either or. I'm more inclined towards this one right now, but just based on the waveform. But it certainly could be this one if different circumstances. Very cool. And Ariel makes the point that, yep, the only one that can know or could have known is the guy at the bedside. But this is one of those in which you potentially could increase the inspiratory time and hide those two efforts under the inspiratory time for this patient. Just thinking that this is an early cycle and it's actually two breaths underneath. I don't know. All righty. Well, we analyzed 3. It seems that 3 is the magic number for our VentRounds. I would stop putting 4. But very, very nice work, input from everyone. I will pause for a second to see if there's any questions or commentaries that we need to address. And if not, I put here the CME for the VentRounds. And here's again the CME, and here's the link for the SEVA webpage if you want to share that with whoever it wants. The more that come, the more that we learn. Send us your waveforms. We love to put them here. To the next SEVA VentRounds is in 15 days, and at that time, what we'll do is show some of the really cool images. I have some from Ariel, some from Juan Martin. So I mean, we're getting really good cases. And you can see these are happening every day. That's the crazy thing. You can find all these desynchronies every day or discordances all around us. So I hope that you have a beautiful end of summer, and thank you for sharing. Great job, Udi, Patrick, and Ahmed. Really impressive reading. Thank you very much. Have a good day.